Hello, this is Alexis Ziegler with the next chapter of Integrated Activism, Chapter 5, I believe it is. This chapter is about throughput. Annihilation equals economic vitality, about how the industrial economy affects our values around consumption, around selfishness. We tend to think of human nature as greedy, selfish, short-sighted, and horny, which is to say humans overpopulate naturally. We tend to blame that or hold accountable the overpopulation and overconsumption in modern times, hold human nature accountable for that, to establish agency with this innate human tendencies we have to overconsume and overproduce. The thing is, there's no historical, scientific, anthropological evidence to support that. It's a flat earth conclusion. It's something that seems obvious, and yet once you look at the bigger perspective, it's completely wrong. Human cultures value that which serves the culture. So the question is, these things that we're calling human nature, how are they related to our modern industrial economy? In what ways does it serve our culture for us to be greedy, selfish, or short-sighted? So we're going to, in this case, skip the broad ethnographic background. We'll actually come back to that a bit in a later chapter in terms of human values, and simply look at industrial economy. What values, what beliefs does industrial economy support around consumption? And let's start particularly with the 20th century, because that's when a major transition to consumerism began. Here we have a picture of an early 20th century city and the trolley lines going down the middle. The transportation systems of modern cities, the trolleys in particular, transformed the city, because you can see these radial arrows going out. What happened was the trolley lines ran on radial arrows, or like spokes going out from a wheel from the major cities back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the developers began to build housing of various sorts along those spokes, along those trolley lines. And then in the early 20th century, particularly by the 1920s, the automobile allowed developers to begin to fill in between the trolley lines. And that's when we see the real birth or expansion of modern suburbia, because the area between the spokes prior to this had been open land, and suddenly it's becoming filled in with suburbia. And here we see, I think this is actually a fairly modern suburb, but it's amusing in the sense of you've got what could be an old trolley line converted into a roadway, and then another spoke there. And historically you would have had housing right along the spokes in the early 20th century, but with the automobile, all the area between the spokes began to be filled in, and the suburbs began to really explode around modern American cities. This is also not coincidentally, or the same historical period when we see the breakdown of extended farm families and the development of much of smaller families in smaller housing, private apartments or small houses, suburban houses. And the capitalists of the early 20th century saw this whole process as an enormous boon. Housing ownership as well as car ownership. In the 1920s, the early 1920s, a minority of Americans owned cars. Very few people owned cars. In a single decade, we converted to a society where the majority of people owned cars. By the end of the 1920s, it was like 70% or so of Americans had access to an automobile. And with the breakdown of these extended families, and at this point, most women, not all, but many women are still at home being housewives or homemakers. The growth of appliances, modern appliances, washers, and all sorts of toasters, individual cook stoves. These things have been shared in farm families, bigger families, even villages to some extent in the past, or whatever machines they had. Now we see the individualization of home equipment, and it was tremendously profitable for the modern industry to produce all of these cars, all of these devices for people to use. So what we see then is a rapid and radical acceleration of production and consumption I wouldn't try to glorify the 1800s, because certainly the social values back then were in many ways not what we would want to go back to. But environmentally, it was, by its very structure, a much more conservationist society than the 20th century, the 1900s, because things were much more shared. With the development of individual housing, consumption rates went through the roof. And it's really in this period that we see the growth of advertising. The 1920s were a pivotal decade. As I said, the automobile ownership expanded, but also advertising. The whole consumer society was really born in the beginning of the 20th century. And it's so ironic that we look at this incredibly greedy, consumeristic aspects of modern American culture and call it human nature. It's really only about a century old that we've been so consumeristic. And it was not coincidentally tied to an industrial society that was growing very quickly in terms of production. So if they were going to produce all that stuff, the only way it could work is to have people buy all that stuff. And of course, Keynesian economics came along in the 1930s after the Great Depression, when the capitalists finally realized that if they paid their workers enough, the workers could buy the stuff that they produce, and it would be a virtuous cycle, at least in terms of profit. The environment, of course, is another question. The automobile, the development of the gasoline engine, the popularization of easily accessible gasoline engines transformed American society. The Model T in particular, Ford spit these things out at minimal profit, and they were converted to tractors. You see two tractors on your right. They were converted to trucks or used as trucks on your left. There's a Model T snowmobile down below that completely transformed American society. So we see the mechanization, the individualization of the United States in the early 20th century, and the growth of consumer society. That's when these values that we call human nature were really created. And what's happened since then, as we've gone through cycles of economic booms and recessions in between, every economic boom since the late 1800s has been powered by this mating of automobiles and housing construction. It's the overconsumption dream. The amount of resources Americans can consume by buying houses and cars is absolutely phenomenal. And what it creates is a tremendous throughput, an enormous flow-through of resources flowing through our economy. If we leave coal underground or we leave the trees in the forest, they don't do anything for our economy. We dig up coal, we process trees, we dig up resources of all sorts, call the natural environment a resource, and then expend it at a great rate. Every dollar we spend becomes a form of economic stimulus that propels the economy forward, of course, based on accelerating fossil fuel consumption. And we have to. The point here is that the values that we hold are driven by the economic needs of society. Our values, our psychological tendencies, do not drive economic tendencies. Rather, it's the other way around, as much as we have been taught to believe otherwise. Gandhi used this word, this is Mahatma Gandhi in India, Swadeshi, to mean home economy, of small-scale localized economy, produce locally, buy locally, support the home economy. He was doing this, of course, in the context of opposing British colonial rule over India. I mean, obviously, if we wanted a smaller-scale economy, we could choose that, or perhaps that's obvious. It's obvious to me. I suppose it's not so obvious to other people. So we have a series of small-scale farmers and weavers across the top of the slide there. So if we have a localized economy, localized farmers sowing seed, plowing the fields, weaving their own clothing, keep things small-scale, what does it lead to? Well, it leads to a self-sustaining local economy, potentially. The consumer society down there at the bottom, as symbolized by that rather monstrous automobile, is part of an industrial process. If we have the Swadeshi economy, we don't have massive iron smelters. Maybe we have really small ones, but we don't have massive ones. We don't have massive nuclear plants. The iron smelter that generated the steel to create that massive automobile generates the steel that also builds tanks. There is a direct and powerful link between the throughput economy and military power, economic power. So we tend to think of this tendency of ours to consume resources as being a psychological thing. No, not at all. It stimulates the economy. Given enough fossil fuel, the more resources we use, the more powerful our economy becomes. It's an enormously ecologically destructive process. The more powerful our economy becomes, the more iron smelters we have that produce consumer goods, the more resources we have available to produce military hardware, the more control we have over the global flow of currency. Let's talk about housing for a minute, because there's a whole green building movement now, which unfortunately is about 99% greenwash. If you look historically at how people have housed themselves, you see all sorts of mud huts, straw, adobe, use of natural materials. And notice these things tend to be on the ground, close to the ground. They tend to be cozy, for lack of a better word. They're simple, but they're not. They stand up to the local climate well. That's what they're intended to do. But they're humble, and as you can see different adaptations for different environments. But the traditional villager's cottage was more warm, thermally stable, more environmentally sound than the big housing that came later. And I couldn't help but throw on a couple of my own little mud huts, as it were, the last two slides on this slideshow, on this slide. These are both built with different materials. The one in the middle there, this one here, is a little solar-powered cabin. That is built entirely with materials pulled out of the dumpsters. This one over here is actually built with crumpled up newspaper and a bit of stucco. The point being that you can use, in the ancient context and the modern context, locally available materials to build modest housing that sits on the ground, that is thermally stable, that works really well. But of course, as society became very stratified, power became very based on one's social status, everybody wants a big house. First, the rich people, back in the early industrial era, started building big houses on the hill. As more and more people got wealthy, everybody wants a big house. So we have one big house after another, and now in modern America, the square footage per person has tripled in the late 20th century. 3 times as much square footage housing available to each American, and something like 10 times as much commercial square footage. So we're trading off square footage for environmental soundness or for thermal stability. You can't build a big palace, or it's not easy to build a big palace out of the mud and straw and the materials you saw in that earlier slide. They tend to be big, thin wall houses built with wood and nowadays plastic. So the entire society has chosen to mimic these large, thin-walled, uninsulated or poorly insulated structures that had their beginning in the early ages of the development of class stratification in modern society. And again, the result is throughput. Massive flow-through of resources, massive economic stimulus. And again, it leads to an economy that is of such a scale that we can afford to build aircraft carriers, we can afford to do things we could not otherwise do. Let's look at another way that this throughput, this tendency to want to move resources through our economy for economic reasons, regardless of the ecological impact, how does that affect our values? How does that affect what we think? And let's look at protein versus sugar, good versus evil, question mark? Because protein and sugar are both vital nutrients. I mean, we think of protein in very glorious terms. It's good for health. Every bodybuilder, even these days, seems to think they need to consume an enormous amount of protein. We think of sugar as being somewhat evil, but in fact, of course, at a cellular level, everything you eat that's not a mineral or a vitamin gets broken down to sugar. I mean, the glucose in your bloodstream, starches get broken down to glucose, fats get broken down to glucose. That's what your cells consume as energy. So in a way, sugar is more important than protein, at least in a very short-term sort of way. And in the long term, they're both just nutrients. That's all they are. And I'm not talking about refined white sugar here per se. I mean, when we eat, even if we kill a wild animal, whatever fat is in that animal is broken down to sugar at the cellular level. So there's no particular reason to look at any particular nutrient as good or evil. I mean, the balance of nutrition, of course, is what's important. But let's look at how our culture has symbolized things. Well, let me go back to that previous slide, actually, because there was an important point to be made there that I didn't make, which is this picture dates all the way back to the turn of the 20th century. I don't have a precise date on it, but you can tell from the equipment that we're looking at something over 100 years old. So this is a western farm And the point of the picture is to look at the scale of the agricultural equipment. There are a bunch of horses. You see all these horses. I don't know how many horses there are pulling that thing, but you can see a whole group of horses pulling what I believe is a harvester, although it's a little hard to tell from the picture. The point is that if you study American agricultural history, by the late 1800s, late Victorian era, the problem of overproduction had already become a serious economic problem for farmers. It came and went, but essentially since the post-Civil War era, overproduction has been the persistent problem of American farming. Of course, it changes a bit with economic ups and downs, and certainly in wartime, farmers make more money. But generally, the problem American farmers have had is producing too much stuff that they can't sell it at a profit. So this affects how we think about food. We tend to think of ourselves, we have certain tendencies. We like certain things because that's just human nature. Well, no. What's the economic meaning of what we like? What's the feedback loop? So there's an interesting book, Jack Spratt's Legacy. It's there in the footnote if you want to look it up. It's in the book, naturally. And this is a quote from the book. Meat, dairy, and egg industries and their academic and political allies have not only influenced our nation's food and nutrition policies, it has determined those policies. So I don't know about the grammar there. I just pulled that out of the book. But in any case, we see the mountain of grain there in the upper left of the slide. The agricultural overproduction, as I said, has been this persistent problem. So if you've got a mountain of corn, what do you do with it? Well, you can make it into corn muffins. There's our mountain of corn. Make it into corn muffins. Try to get people to eat corn muffins. You can make it into beer. You can make it into corn syrup and make soda pop. The problem with these three categories is they don't reduce grain all that effectively. It's beer perhaps a little more so, but a corn muffin is a direct conversion. You just take the corn and grind it up, make it into a muffin. Now, if you take corn and you feed it to cows, there's nearly a 10-to-1 reduction. In other words, it concentrates that grain into meat, into dairy products, ice cream. There's a pretty good concentration with the beer, too. And here we have sugar versus protein. We think of sugar as being somehow bad, and protein, oh boy, that's what bodybuilders use. That's good for you. The problem, of course, is that meat and dairy are linked to the three leading causes of death in the Western world: heart attack, stroke, cancer. 1, 2, 3. They are directly linked to, I think it's fair to say, caused by excessive meat and fat consumption and a lack of fiber and vegetable and plant consumption. So the point is that we have idealized protein specifically because there's been a long history of the USDA, which was created in the early 20th century to promote agricultural products, promoted those products which were profitable for the farmer, meat and dairy, encouraged Americans to eat them. Americans ate them in increasing volume, became our leading three causes of death, the cause of the leading three causes of death. But the economic imperative of throughput, of keeping the economy going, has influenced our values, what we think of as food, what we think of as good food. So we think of values as determining culture. The reality is values tend to be an outgrowth of the central structures of society. It's upside down from the way we normally think, but that is how it works. So in the modern world, if you want oil, you've got to have dollars. Dollars equal oil. This is a Haitian currency, Haitian bill, 250, whatever they are. Can you buy oil with it? No, you can't. Oil is traded in dollars, sometimes these days in euros. Americans can print dollars, effectively create dollars and go buy oil with it. Haitians cannot. Neither can any other country in the world produce their own currency, simply print currency and go buy oil with it. So this is another piece of throughput. The modern industrial economy, particularly the United States, and to some extent Europe, the global currency has to go through us. If you want to trade on a global scale, you have to trade through dollars, particularly for energy. So this is another impact of throughput. The more we consume, the more we move through the economy, the American economy, we burn up the world, we destroy the world, but in the process we become tremendously wealthy and powerful. And this is the reason we value greed. This is the reason we look at that red sports car, that big house, and say, wow, that's cool, I want one of those. What we think, what we believe, how we feel is influenced by the economic impacts of those thoughts, feelings, and actions. It's a feedback loop that goes back around. Our thoughts, feelings, and actions do not simply determine our culture. It just doesn't work that way. The ideology that success in the growth-based industrial economy proves itself morally virtuous means that the owning class will choose to destroy a world in which they are in charge rather than let a world live in which they are not in charge. This is a stark reality we face right now. Given the power of throughput to stimulate a modern economy, given the enormous environmental destruction caused by throughput, the reality is that those who are in charge, the wealthy class now, however you want to identify them, are going to destroy the world in which we live rather than release control. And it's an ideology of moral virtue. If you win in the market economy, the ideology is that you won because you were virtuous. So winning, in this sense, is contingent on maintaining throughput, which is destroying the environment at a rapid rate. Each culture supports, reinforces, and holds in high esteem those behaviors that are necessary for the survival and well-being of the group. So we evolved in hunting and gathering groups, as per the picture on the left. And in those groups, and in fact in most cultures studied by anthropologists, people who serve the group, people who are humble, even if they're big men or chiefs, until cultures get very large and begin to approach state-level societies, the chiefs, the headmen, are supposed to be humble servants of the group. They're supposed to have this social attitude. So people who are valued, in fact, people who leave more children behind, if you want to put it in a Darwinian sense, it's very clear that the people who are work toward the betterment of the group in traditional village-level, band-level societies are the ones who, that behavior was what was selected for. It's what worked economically, because a high degree of cooperation was necessary. Cohesive groups were much better at survival. You can go all the way back to why the Homo sapien displaced Homo sapien neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals. And it almost certainly has to do with more effective, cohesive social organization and people who are able to facilitate that social organization. So basically, human virtue as we know it was born in these cooperative groups, and it was effective in these cooperative groups. Now, modern industrial economy has turned human nature on its head. The cutthroat capitalist might be now, historically, if the humble servant of the group was idealized by the group and held in high social esteem, now sociopaths are held in high social esteem. The cutthroat capitalist with the fat car and the fat house. It's quite a striking reversal of human social evolution. How do we fix it? The global industrial economy is making an awful mess. Do we fix it politically, or do we fix it with our own behavior, our own economic organization? Who claims agency? Who is in charge? The entire Western intellectual tradition at every level, academic, political, religious, is a big project to convince us that powerful people are important, that they are in charge, and we are not in charge. The reality is that human culture, the evolution of human values, remains, and has always been the product of our sum total of collective economic activity. So how we choose to organize ourselves at a grassroots economic level over the long term determines our social values, determines the structure of our society. So we'll talk more about how we can reorganize our society to be more sustainable, to fix the throughput economy. The throughput economy trumps our environmental efforts utterly. This idea that we can make things more efficient in the throughput economy is just nuts. We have to restructure it from the very bottom. So we'll talk more about that in coming slideshows. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.